Good afternoon, and welcome to Criminal Justice Amid COVID-19, a special ISN Live broadcast. My name is Chris Kerr with the Ignatian Solidarity Network. For over 15 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been uniting the Ignatian family. That means the Jesuit network, as well as those who are inspired to work for justice through the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola, to build a more just world through faith-based social justice formation, education, and advocacy. If you haven't already, please check out our website, ignatiansolidarity.net, and like and follow us on social media to get the latest advocacy alerts, educational resources, and much more. Today, we are joined by partners from our broad network to discuss the realities experienced by those in the U.S. criminal justice system during the COVID-19 pandemic, including our court systems, in prisons, and for those re-entering society. As we join together as an Ignatian family, we're holding all people affected by COVID-19 in our prayers. While the effects of this COVID-19 crisis are bringing many challenges within our criminal justice system to light, our work as advocates for criminal justice reform is not new. Through advocacy by organizations like the Jesuit Social Research Institute, direct service by organizations like Homeboy Industries and the Jesuit Restorative Justice Initiative, the educational courses provided by many of our universities to incarcerated men and women, and the accompaniment by many Jesuit prison chaplains, the Ignatian family has long been addressing injustice ingrained in this system, related to race, poverty, and the dignity of all people. We hope that this conversation, which was co-organized with our partners at the Jesuit Conference Office of Justice and Ecology, animates our network to advocate for those marginalized during this time. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, with us is Kara Gotch, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Sentencing Project, a national criminal justice research and advocacy organization. She oversees the organization's federal advocacy work and has successfully led efforts to pass federal drug sentencing reforms. Gotch previously led the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, a project of the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society, composed of 50 national faith-based organizations that sought to advance federal reforms in sentencing, re-entry, and collateral consequences of incarceration. Secondly, we have Cristina Dominguez, who is a graduate of St. Ignatius College Prep, Jesuit High School in San Francisco, as well as Fordham University in the Bronx. She received her master's in social work from Columbia University and worked for 7 years as a social worker with criminal justice populations at Rikers Island, Homeboy Industries, and public defense organizations in both California as well as New York. After graduating law school at SUNY School of Law in 2015, she became a public defender in Los Angeles County. And finally, we're joined by Zach Prizzuti, who is in formation to become a Jesuit priest and is the co-founder of the Thrive for Life Prison Project, which creates opportunities for spiritual development and provides educational resources for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals while partnering with local universities and local employers. He is currently in his second year of studies at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, working towards his Master's of Divinity. God willing, in his words, he will be ordained to the transitional diaconate in October and the priesthood in June 2021 in New York City. He is grateful for and humbled by the call to work among incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. So welcome to Kara, Cristina, and Zach. We're so grateful to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time to join us amidst this crisis to offer perspectives. Kara, before we jump too deep into our discussion around criminal justice and COVID-19, can you provide some context for us so that we all are on the same page when we talk about the criminal justice system? When we say that phrase, criminal justice system, what is the scope of what we're talking about? What is the scope of that system in the United States? And maybe can you help us understand, what's the difference between the federal system and the state system? Maybe between the words jails and prisons, things like that. Can you give us the big picture?
Sure. Well, the real big picture is that the United States is the world leader in incarceration. We have about 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in prisons and jails in this country. A prison is primarily consists of people who have been sentenced to felony convictions. Easy shorthand way of knowing that is someone who has a sentence of longer than a year. Jails are comprised of people who are awaiting, who are pretrial, who have not been convicted of a crime. That's the majority of who is there, or people who have been sentenced to misdemeanors offenses. And those are generally people sentenced to less than a year. We are the largest incarcerator, but we also have an even larger criminal justice supervision footprint. We have about 5 million people who are living in the community, but under supervision, either probation or parole supervision. So we're talking in excess of 7 million people in this country who are under the authority of the government and criminal sanction. There is no other country that matches that either per capita or by sheer number. It is a system that has significant racial disparity. Of boys born, 18-year-old boys, 1 in 3 today, African-American boys who are about 18 today, can expect to spend some time incarcerated. Among Latino boys born about 18 years ago, 1 in 6 can expect to spend some time incarcerated. Among white males, it's about white boys born about 18 years ago. You can 1 in 17 can expect to spend some time in their life incarcerated. These are staggering statistics, and racial disparity permeates the entire system, from the likelihood of an individual. African American are more likely to be stopped by police. They're more likely to be arrested when stopped. When they are arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, regardless of the offense. And when they're convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced to incarceration. So it's throughout the process that there is racial disparity and built in. And so that is part of the reason why about 60% of the people incarcerated in this country are people of color. And it's really something that is central to the reason why we have mass incarceration. We have a failure to address structural racism in our society, to invest in community resources, to invest in a stable safety net has contributed to our reliance in this country on mass incarceration.
Thanks, Kara. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the federal system versus the state system, those pieces, and then help us, as I said earlier, help us understand the difference when we hear someone say prison versus jails. What is that differentiation there? What is that? What's that all about?
Yeah, sure. So each state and locality has their own criminal justice system, as does the federal government. So most of the work I do is at the federal level. There are about 170,000 people who are incarcerated in federal prisons across the country. They are residents of all states, and they could be housed anywhere in the country in a federal facility. Those people have been convicted of federal offenses. What's interesting about the federal system is the disproportionate number of people incarcerated there are incarcerated for drug crimes. That's because of where our Congress has decided to prioritize its harsh sentencing policy and how prosecutors have decided to prioritize their time. Interestingly, most violent offenses are in fact prosecuted at the state level. Most people who are in prison for a murder, for example, or rape, those folks are going to be in the state systems. They have violated state laws, although there are obviously federal laws against murder and other violent crimes, but most of those cases are prosecuted at the state. Violent offenses are prosecuted at the state level. So, every state has its own criminal code, its own sentencing policy, and that's who ends up in the state system. If you are in Texas, even if you're not a citizen of Texas, if you are in Texas and violate Texas law, that you would be subject to the penalties of that state. as I said, I think I mentioned earlier, people who are in jail are more likely to be people housed pre-trial. They have not yet been convicted of a crime or serving misdemeanor offenses. People who are in prison are those serving sentences for a felony conviction, which roughly saying are sentences longer than a year. Misdemeanor sentences tend to be less than a year of incarceration or probation or some sort of community supervision sentence. So that's part of what makes criminal justice reform so complicated and challenging, is that every state has its own system and there is the federal system. So if you are someone who's interested in trying to influence mass incarceration, for example, that means taking up the mantle in every single state, and at the national level to try and advance reform. It's a painstaking process and takes a lot of engagement from the entire community to accomplish the kind of change we need.
Thanks, Karen. I think just in your description of the kind of the enormity of the system, it speaks to the complexity of it. So much so that, in many of the points you're making, I was reminded that it's not just our criminal justice laws at the national level or the state level that impact things, but kind of the entire fabric of the social system that contributes to the realities of our criminal justice system. So really appreciate those comments. Let's take a step now to Zach, and Zach, if you can provide a little bit of kind of the moral context in the realm of the Jesuit and kind of broader Catholic network. Can you give us some context for why this justice issue is important to us as people of faith? And maybe, even more specifically, is there an Ignatian way of thinking about issues of criminal justice?
Thank you, Chris. I think it really starts with this whole notion of who am I to my neighbor, right? I mean, that is a major theme of the Hebrew Bible and into the Christian scriptures. There's this constant reminder of the question posed of who am I to my neighbor? And it's always boils down to I'm to love my neighbor. I'm to love my neighbor as I love myself. And Jesus takes it a little bit farther. We're to love our enemies more than people that love us. So it's really introduces an ethic here of between individuals. Regarding the criminal justice system, I think it's very interesting when studying it within the church. I remember when I was getting my master's degree in social work from St. Louis University, I had an embarrassing conversation with one of my professors when she asked me about, well, what has the church said about the criminal justice system? And I thought to myself, oh boy, I better read up on that. And embarrassingly, the church has not really said a lot directly, but they have said some very important things, some things that I think are really important to highlight, even back to Pope Pius XII, he sets out 3 guidelines for dealing with people who are imprisoned: sincere pardon, belief in the good of the other, and love them like the Lord loves them. I mean, maybe that's all we might need, right? Is sincere pardon, to belief in the good of the other, and to love them like the Lord loves them. And then the Second Vatican Council, in the document Gaudium et Spes, again talks about the whole special obligation that we are binded together as neighbors and have an absolute to absolutely everyone. Everyone is our neighbor, absolutely everyone. So that calls into question then, what are we to do with individuals who have been separated from the community, or now in the criminal justice system? And I have to pick up on what Carrie said earlier. I mean, one of the major things are the social structures that have completely victimized many poor people, and predominantly our Black and brown brothers and sisters have been completely trapped within the system that brings them to incarceration. So number one are the structural sin that binds people or perpetuates this mammoth system that we call the criminal justice system in this country, as Carrie was saying. So the 2.2 million people. So one of the things that people of faith really are called to understand are these structural barriers that trap people within this vicious downward spiral that ends up into a 9 by 12 prison cell. So that's really important to note is this structural sin. And sometimes as a church, we can get caught up in personal sin, like my sin that I ate meat on, my sin. Well, and you go to confession and you get absolution. But how often do we go to confession and confess our how we've been complicit in structural sins? How often do we go to confession to confess that I've been complicit in these unjust racial systems that's trapping our Black and brown people into the criminal justice system? And then I would say the Ignatian lens is this whole notion of the very beginning of the retreat of St. Ignatius of understanding people as infinitely loved by God, because that's all God can do. All God can do is love. God is just love that keeps on keeping on. And yes, we sin. We have delighted in causing harm and destruction to one another, but that doesn't nullify God's love that keeps on keeping on. And the believer, the person of faith, is called to labor with God in that healing of the world. And I think that that's really what's needed structurally within our system. Thanks,
Zach. And Kara, maybe if we just come back to you for a second. I know you led a coalition of faith-based organizations, within the Methodist tradition or organized by the Methodist tradition. Are there things that you found in terms of communicating about these issues or inviting people to reflect on these issues in the context of their faith that you found to be very effective ways of kind of inviting people into, maybe changing their view or changing their perspective?
Absolutely. I think some of the most effective work I've done in criminal justice reform has been when working with the faith community. And I should say, I have enjoyed my partnership with the Jesuit Conference and the Ignatian Solidarity Network for many years now. And so I really appreciate being part of this conversation. When I worked with the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, it was a really important time. The work was focused on the national level and federal reforms. It was an important time because that coalition was able to bridge really important gaps in educating lawmakers about the realities of mass incarceration and the great harm that was being caused. And I really think it was the work of this Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, for example, that moved Senator Grassley of Iowa, who at the time was a new chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, had been spoken very publicly about his distaste for sentencing reform. He was not going to be supportive of what he called the leniency industrial complex. But the coalition really, after many months of persuasion, op-eds and letters to the editor, and wrote a letter to him, particularly clergy leaders in the state of Iowa, convinced him that this was really a moral issue. And as an individual who considered themselves a person of faith, as Mr. Grassley does, and as someone who believes in the intrinsic value of all human beings and believes in their sacred worth, that sentencing reform was very much in line with that belief system. And he really did a complete 180 and ended up championing really important legislation in the Senate as chairman, passed it through his committee. While it didn't pass ultimately during the time that I was at the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, that work really was the precursor to the First Step Act. And it was Senator Grassley who years earlier had made his commitment to the faith community that he would support sentencing reform and believe that mandatory minimums for drug offenses at the federal level were excessive and need to be changed. It was because of his commitment to that, he stood up against the White House that didn't want to pass sentencing reform as part of the First Step Act. And he really kept his promise and has become a true champion for sentencing reform. And I attribute that entirely to the faith faith community, and the influence he had on him and convincing him that this was an issue for all people who care about, the value of all individuals.
That's great. Thanks, Kara. Christina, let's turn to you. Can you talk to us about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic that you're seeing in your role as a public defender? How has the pandemic changed the way that jails, representation of clients, trials, and sentencing look like? And just generally, how are people being affected by this?
Certainly. And when I speak, it's all with the understanding that everything that Zach and Kara have spoken about is what's happening still in Los Angeles and in many of the local jurisdictions. But so with that already in place, we now have the crisis of a pandemic, and a crisis of a pandemic that means that folks cannot be contained. They can't be in those 9x12 cells. They cannot be overly incarcerated. It is a public health issue. And that's not to say that there aren't numerous public health issues that have previously come out of incarcerating and over-incarcerating individuals. But this in particular has been very interesting, to say the least, in regards to how LA County in particular is trying to reduce their inmate population. So Los Angeles County has the largest prosecutorial body in the United States that also has the largest jail population. Just jail, so it's different from prison and federal custody. But LA County Jail typically has anywhere between 16,000 and 17,000 inmates on any given day that are in custody. Most of them are awaiting trial. Some of them are serving one-year sentences. And so the whole goal for the Public Defender's Office generally, and for individuals that are anti-incarceration and are pro-abolition, is to really reduce jail populations. And now we've got stakeholders, including the Sheriff's Department and the prosecutorial body, the LA District Attorney, in addition to the Department of Public Health, putting pressure on jail personnel to reduce those populations. So the mission that we as public defenders already have is now garnering a lot of support through the pandemic. And so while we are working vigorously to get folks out of jail, and the prosecutor's office is doing what they think is best to get folks out of custody, and the Sheriff's Department's doing what they think is best to get folks out of custody, it's really just a very, very, very small drop in a large bucket of what needs to be done in regards to releasing folks from custody. Right now, the rates of positive tests in LA County Jail, they're public. You can go on the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department website. We're getting 40 to 50 positive tests a day. Folks are being tested as they're coming into custody, so they're still arresting quite a few people, testing them and placing them in quarantine. So there are significant issues as it relates to folks' constitutional rights that the pandemic is really highlighting. And again, this is, I think both Kara and Zach really talked about all of the structural issues that lead to mass incarceration. And the pandemic really is, and this is the silver lining, I think, peeling back the curtain. So we're really seeing the public health issues, the constitutional issues. What does it mean to be charged with a crime? What kind of conduct really constitutes a crime? What does it mean to, have bail set? So all of these kind of issues that all of us have been working on for years and acknowledged to be serious impediments to freedom of individuals, to nourishment of communities, is really coming forth in this pandemic.
Thanks, Christina. Let's jump back to Kara for a second to talk a little bit about what is happening on a national level in prisons. Kara, in your work with the Sentencing Project, what impacts are you seeing in the midst of this crisis for prisoners, for people in prisons, and what's the danger to being in a prison? And I would imagine it's not just a danger for those who are incarcerated, but also for those who are working in prisons, those who are supporting people, even those who are ministering to them as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when this pandemic struck, we sort of immediately, my colleagues and I and our coalition partners really reflected on, wow, this could be really bad for incarcerated people if we don't act quickly to raise the alarm bells for lawmakers, both at the federal level and at the state and local level. And unfortunately, that has materialized the reason for our concern. As of May 6th, the most recent data I have, over 20,000 people who are incarcerated have been infected with COVID-19. Over 300 people have died 300 incarcerated people have died. It is nothing. It is not abating. The virus continues to spread. More people are being infected as I speak, and more people are dying. It is really a tragic and frightening experience. My organization and organizations that we partner with have been working very hard to incentivize and encourage leaders to recognize that conditions in prisons and jails are really are what this virus wants. That it is impossible to social distance. People don't have free access to soap and sanitizer. Conditions are often unsanitary. And so these institutions are absolute incubators. And when you're introducing an environment where staff every day are coming in and out, they are the ones who brought these viruses in, mostly unknowingly, and has led to its spread. There is an institute in prisons in Ohio, for example, where 80% of the population has been infected with COVID-19. I mean, that is devastating. We are just now getting these numbers of infection rates, but the reality is testing is not widespread. The number in about a week went up significantly of how many people have tested positive, but that is mostly because a handful of states has started widely testing people, but we still don't know the full extent of the impact because testing is not widely available. Staff are also very vulnerable. They don't have all the tools they need, like PPE, personal protective equipment. People who are incarcerated don't have easy access to that. I know at the federal level, in hotspot prisons where they've had high infection rates, people who are incarcerated are getting 2 paper masks per month. That is unacceptable. That's not going to last someone and protect them for the long term from infection, particularly in a facility that they know the virus is present. We are very concerned about what the implications are going to be. We're very concerned about what's happened so far. And, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid. We expect the numbers and the rates of death to increase substantially. I can't hear you if you're asking me a question. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah. What were you, thanks. What were you, I think the question was, what solutions has the Sentencing Project offered, as a response to this reality? Because clearly the situation is dire. And to your point, this is an environment where the virus can really excel, and it's kind of the perfect storm in terms of people's proximity and things like that. So what are some alternatives?
So our primary recommendation is to significantly reduce the number of people who are incarcerated in jails and prisons. Now, jails are important, particularly because there's a lot of churn into a jail, right? I mean, people aren't there for long term. They come in and out on a daily basis. So the likelihood of infection is very high when you're introducing lots of new people every day into a system. Also, that population is primarily not convicted of anything, and or they've been convicted of very low level offenses. And so from our position, we think we could significantly lower the incarcerated population in jails to begin with and have no negative effect on public safety. And we would like to see that happen in facilities across jail facilities across the country. For prisons, we think that we should also be we also are urging decarceration, because there are very vulnerable populations in prisons throughout the country that are very at heightened risk for serious illness and death from COVID-19. And those would be elderly people and individuals with chronic health conditions. Now, because we are a mass incarcerator in this country and we have extreme sentencing, we have also a very large elderly population. And people who are elderly, as we know through CDC guidelines, are very much at risk from COVID-19. Also, people who are in prisons are disproportionately, compared to the general population, likely to have serious health conditions because of a lifetime of poor health. They haven't had access to regular preventative medical care. They may have a history of substance use disorder or mental health issues that have compromised their general health. And so we know from statistics that many people who are in prison also have very poor health to begin with, which also makes them very vulnerable to COVID-19. So first and foremost, we need to implement the CDC guidelines within institutions, which includes physical distancing. And in places like Ohio or in the federal prison system where overcrowding runs rampant, we need to, at the very least, end overcrowding, so that facilities are not, where people can distance at least 6 feet apart. But the problem is a lot of institutions aren't even set up that way. Even if they don't have crowding, it's still impossible to social distance, like in dormitory style units, right? Where people are bunked one on top of each other and, they sleep 3 feet away from someone else. How do you social distance? So social distancing is really a critical element.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. And Christina, did you want to offer some perspective on that question?
I did. Thank you, Kara. I think you brought up the initially protocols and procedures and following CDC guidelines. And in LA County, I can tell you that branch to branch and jail facility to jail facility, it's an uneven application of protocols and an uneven application of procedures. I have colleagues who have clients that are in custody that don't have masks on. I myself have represented clients that are in custody with masks on. Some of them have the proper PPEs within the courthouses, but not necessarily in their jails. So that's just an illustration to Kara's larger point that prison and jail populations are not following CDC, are not receiving the benefit of the CDC guidelines that have been provided to the public. Moreover, I think Kara touched on pretrial release and working in the county system. Most, if not all, of my clients are pre-conviction, pre-plea clients, which means that, yes, they should be eligible for release or bail. I think it's been very interesting to see what types of charges that the district attorney's office or prosecutors, I think in many local jurisdictions, are opting out of setting bail on and allowing OR or allowing individuals to be released on their own recognizance. I think that's important to pay attention to, because pre-pandemic, bail was being set on some of these charges, where now that there's a public safety a public health concern, the public safety issue we're realizing really wasn't existent in the first place, and that the over-incarceration of folks isn't because of public safety so much as it is because bail is being set. There's a predatory prosecutorial system in place in local jurisdictions that doesn't allow individuals who are nonviolent or individuals who are not a risk to public safety or individuals who have pled not guilty and are contesting the charges. It's now allowing those individuals to be released in a way that they weren't previously. And I think it's very important for all of us who are looking to criminal justice reform to really pay attention to how and what charges post-pandemic bail resumes to be set on, because I think that there are strong arguments for folks that are looking to change the criminal justice system and folks that are looking to really either end cash bail or modify it, to really pay attention to what charges during the pandemic are not being, where bail is not being sought versus pre-pandemic, and then if they try to resume seeking bail in the future. And I think it's just interesting, especially in a jurisdiction like Los Angeles, where incarceration rates, pre-plea incarceration rates are very, very, very high. I think it's important to note that the system itself really isn't taking into account its own history. I think that there is a certain amount of individualism within like the sheriff's department and the prosecutor's office, where now that there's a public health issue that has to do with them, because a lot of the folks that are being released and going home aren't necessarily living and working in the same communities as the prosecutors and the sheriffs, but because the sheriffs don't want to be infected and the prosecutors don't want to necessarily have the exposure, the rates of release are higher. And I think that that's a good thing overall, but I think it's very interesting to see how different criminal justice stakeholders view the pandemic as it relates to public health and the greater good, because I don't know that they're actually paying attention to those larger issues.
Thanks, Christina. And maybe that's something we can get to at the end too, just in terms of kind of public policy coming out of this crisis, right? And how might this inform, how might everything we're experiencing right now inform how we think about our criminal justice system moving forward. But let's go to Zach for a second. Zach, can you share some of the work that Thrive for Life engages in to meet the needs of formerly incarcerated individuals? And can you talk a little bit about how the work is being impacted by COVID-19?
Sure, absolutely. So Thrive for Life Prison Project in New York City, we do two things. One is behind the walls, the other is beyond the walls. Behind the walls, we offer spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius to people who are incarcerated. So these are just tools that give God a chance in people's lives. And our spiritual mentors are not able to be doing that in the various correctional facilities in the New York metropolitan area right now because of the pandemic. And then beyond the walls, we have a house. The house is called Ignacio House, and it's near Fordham University in the Bronx. And this is a house of studies for people who are formerly incarcerated, who are reentering the community and continuing their studies with our partnering universities and colleges like NYU, like Columbia, like St. Francis College in Brooklyn, like Manhattan College. And this is a community of formerly incarcerated people who are continuing their studies or their job workforce training. Now, right now, the scholars in the house are not able to go to their respective universities, obviously because of the pandemic. So they're continuing to do their studies. What we see with our guys is not unusual of what we're seeing throughout the world, right? It's 100% unemployment. People have lost their jobs. We had a couple of guys just get out of the state system a couple of weeks ago, 20 some years locked up, greeted with all this unemployment, not able to find a job, didn't have a job even to go to file for unemployment, right? So the morale of the community at Ignacio House is something that has been a really important part of our accompaniment of the residents at Ignacio House. So right now we aren't able to do anything behind the walls because the system isn't permitting any outside services. But beyond the walls and helping accompany the individuals as they're reentering the community is becoming a really a more intense experience because as Carrie and Christina have talked about, the systems are trying to release people due to this pandemic. But I do want to pick up on something that Christina said regarding the pandemic, that the pandemic is exposing all the reality of the system to begin with, all the flaws that have been there from the beginning. But I would also say the pandemic is exposing all the flaws to reentry. There are no plans for people once they're getting out. There are no continuity of care for an individual once they're getting out, and that can be frightening to reentry organizations because has there been testing going on in the facility? Have people been experiencing social distancing? Have people in the facility been tested positive for COVID? The answer is we don't know. So I think I really want to highlight what Christina and Carrie were talking about. These types of things are so important, not only for our sisters and brothers who are locked up and those who work with them behind the walls, but also for this continuity of care once people get out. We need a more comprehensible and sustainable approach to this. And now might be the time because everything's being exposed.
Thanks, Zach. And so that addresses a way that kind of a Jesuit, kind of founded social ministry is responding to people while in the prison system as they're re-entering society. I wanted to look at some perspectives of Jesuit works that are engaged in some other elements of this. Christina, I was hoping that you could give us a little bit of insight into the ways that Faith in Action, as well as Homeboy Industries, are engaged there in Los Angeles and LA County in terms of advocacy around the release of people from jails and prisons during the pandemic, and any efforts that you're seeing kind of in the Southern California region on that front.
Certainly. So I think Homeboy Industries and part of my work has to do with the Ignatian notions of accompaniment and encounter, and I think that is hard to do in the traditional way during the pandemic. I think there are new ways to accompany, and I think advocacy really is a vehicle for accompaniment, because Homeboy Industries really focuses on walking with individuals regardless of what their circumstances are. And I think now that's had to shift. The way that is done has to shift. And so advocacy has really taken a front seat as it relates to these community-based organizations, even the solidarity of Dolores Mission, along with Homeboy Industries, Faith in Action, and their solidarity with social justice movements like Black Lives Matter and the Youth Justice Coalition, as well as the Public Defenders Union. You really see the direct actions and the creative ways that folks at Homeboy and the Youth Justice Coalition and Faith in Action have done in terms of direct action. There have been car protests in downtown LA that went around the county jails with signs in the cars asking for our folks to be let out. And that has a lot to do with the over-incarceration of individuals and the fact that there's a pandemic. So Homeboy's been part of those coalitions. I think also taking the entire organization, as so many programs have done and so many schools have done during these last couple months, is Homeboy's really transferred all of their classes and their life skills classes, their daily schedule, to online classes and online availability, and they're very well attended. I think it keeps folks busy and engaged. And as Zach said, folks coming home, people are still being released from state prison, federal prison, and county jail, and they might not necessarily be able to go to the place that they had originally been planned to go to because of the issue of testing or access to healthcare or just not knowing. And so I think Homeboy's ability to transfer the majority of its curriculum online and engage folks that are newly released, even if it was pre-pandemic, and keep them stimulated, keep them engaged, and keep them not as worried about a paycheck or about income if they're engaged in the program, because as of right now, they are able to, help clients in that regard. So I think it's twofold. I think all of the creative ways that these direct services organizations have really kept their clients engaged and kept folks coming home from prison and jail engaged, and two, the way that they show up for direct action, whether it be a car protest or a virtual town hall meeting, or even just virtual board of supervisors meetings. They're very much engaged, even from their homes, even while sheltering in place and maintaining some sort of public health. So it's been very, very interesting to see the development, I think, of new ways of advocating and accompanying folks.
Sure. Thanks, Christina. And Kara, in terms of the sentencing project, has the pandemic impacted the capacity of your organization to effectively advocate at a federal or state level, as legislators have been maybe a little less active or not able to be interacted with in the same way?
We're steamrolling through with our advocacy, despite our office is closed and we're all working from home. I'm focused on the federal level, and the last 7 or 8 weeks actually have been nonstop, having continued to have meetings on the Hill, been working really hard around the CARES Act that passed at the end of March, and this latest bill, the HEROES Act, that was just unveiled yesterday by the leadership in the House of Representatives. Both the bill yesterday included a lot of the recommendations that my organization have been pushing for, and our coalition partners, including the Justice Roundtable, have been really advocating for, which includes, expanding opportunities for release for vulnerable people, those over the age of 50 and who have chronic health conditions, incentivizing states to do the same, release folks to protect them from infection because of the inability to physically distance for those who are vulnerable and elderly, as well as funding to provide to systems so that they can provide adequate PPE and sanitation as well, making phone calls more accessible for people who are incarcerated to reach their family members, because visitation has ended. Volunteers can't come into facilities, so people who are incarcerated feel extremely isolated, and so their continued communication is really important to stay connected with family members, and so that they can check on their families. Everybody throughout the country is being affected by this, both incarcerated and not, and so we all need to be able to communicate with our families and check on them and make sure that they're healthy and well. So we've been speaking a lot with members of Congress, with staff, both at the federal level and state lawmakers too, to push our recommendations around expediting releases for people who are vulnerable, and to make sure that systems get the resources they need to be effective in combating the virus.
Sure. Thanks for that. And it's heartening to hear that you're going full steam in the midst of this, because obviously the realities that people are facing are going full steam as well, right? So I think that brings us to a good question, maybe to begin to close out our session today, is from where you sit in terms of the work you do, what are ways that people, recognizing that we gather in the context of solidarity, right, of wanting to walk with people where they are in their journey, in their struggle, what are ways that we can walk with those who are within our criminal justice system right now in the coming weeks as people of solidarity? What are ways that as citizens we can take action to call on our government to respond to some of the dire realities that you described in our system, both for those who are currently in a prison or jail, as well as those who are trying to re-enter society? So I just invite you to each have a minute or two to share a couple thoughts or ideas. If there's something specific you want to invite us to call to action to, great. Or if it's a broader kind of theoretical concept, that's okay too. And why don't we, Zach, is it okay if we start with you?
Sure.
Great.
Sure. I'm reminded, Chris, that I think it was Pope John Paul II talked about solidarity, and what he said, that solidarity isn't some vague feeling of compassion, right? And then he went on to unpack that. So I think one of the things that comes from this is an invitation to solidarity. Get involved. With feet on the ground, the work that Christina and Carrie have been talking about, and the momentum and the force that keeps moving forward because people's lives keep moving forward is very important. But there's very concrete things people can do. Certainly in the New York metropolitan area, thriveforlife.org, ignaciohouse.org, and get involved with what we're doing to start with doing the advocacy, certainly against the solitary confinement and accompanying people as they're being released. But some of these bigger, wider national issues, I have to say, people like the Sentencing Project are really doing wonderful work to help make sure that the reforms that we are putting in place now during this unique time are lasting and sustainable. Because again, back to this whole thing, that the pandemic is exposing the flawed system that's been there from the beginning. So now is actually a very opportune time to make the changes that we need to make so that we can accompany our brothers and sisters behind the walls back into the community. And it's only good for us all.
Thanks, Zach. And we've shared the website, the Thrive for Life website there in the social media stream as well, so folks can find that and connect with your work. Christina, why don't we turn it over to you?
Sure. So to add on to what Zach said, it starts locally. I think knowing what's going on within your jurisdiction as it relates to criminal justice populations, being aware of the organizations or getting educated on the organizations that are helping folks come home and settle into home is important, and it's important to support them. And equally as important, it's knowing your lawmakers and being able to reach out to your lawmakers on a local level as well as a state and a federal level, because putting pressure on politicians to acknowledge that there is a public health crisis that's going on in the jails and prisons within your state or city or county is important. I think this is as good a time as any for them to listen. There's emergency bills that are being passed on an almost weekly basis, if not more. And so it's important, I think, for us as constituents to put pressure on our lawmakers to try and get them to pay significant attention to the criminal justice populations, because as Kara said, the pandemic and COVID-19 is exploding in jails and prisons across the United States, regardless of jurisdiction. We're talking federal, state, and local. And so I think it's important that you know who your representatives are and you reach out to them in kind.
Great. Kara, how about for you?
I know for a lot of people this problem, and it is a big problem, and the consequences are life and death. And I think because of that, people might be intimidated or want to give up because it's just too hard to overcome. But I want to assure everybody that there are answers, and there is a way to save lives and help people. And it's to make sure that the government understands, but at all levels, but particularly your representatives in Congress, but at the state level, that the lives of incarcerated people matter, and the lives of their families matter, and the lives of people who work in these facilities matter as well. And they deserve to be protected. And that means giving resources, funding states and localities to address the crisis in our prisons and jails. There is currently in the HEROES Act authorized $500 million to be given to states and localities who can address this crisis, the pandemic in their institutions, by reducing their populations. That money is desperately needed, I know, across the country. And it's up to all of us to encourage our state and local leaders to get that money to apply once it is approved. First, we need to get Congress to pass that authorization. But once it is approved, to utilize it and to, in fact, bring down populations so that social distancing is possible within institutions and we can reduce infections. So there's a lot to pay attention to, but we can overcome it if we make sure resources are put in the hands of people who can make a difference.
Thank you for that, Karen, and thanks to each of you for sharing your work and sharing the reality of this issue during this really challenging time for our country in so many ways, but really bringing light to this. So we're grateful for your time today. Before we finish up, I just have a couple of things I want to share about ways that you can take action and get engaged in future opportunities. So I'd like to invite you to be part of the Ignatian Solidarity Network's efforts to advocate for a more just world in partnership with the Jesuit Conference's Office of Justice and Ecology. You can join us in calling on Congress to ensure the protection of those most in need amid the COVID-19 crisis, including asking our elected officials for measures to improve the economic security of the most vulnerable and address the unique health risks posed to people in our prisons, migrants, low-income communities, and communities of color, which already bear the burden of poor environmental and health conditions. You can take action today by texting COVID, that's COVID, to 202-800-5800. 1541. Again, that's COVID to 202-800-1541. You'll be directed to an action alert where you can send a message to members of Congress right now. So you can be part of a call to action that Karen, Christina, and Zach shared with us immediately. Also, if you enjoyed this ISN Live broadcast of criminal justice amid COVID-19, we invite you to join ISN along with the Jesuit Conference Office of Justice and Ecology and the Catholic Mobilizing Network for a virtual watch party of episode 8 of The Innocence Files, featuring Dwayne Brown, a Texas death row exoneree who has spoken at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. This will take place tomorrow evening, May 14th at 8:30 p.m. Following the screening, all are invited to a question and answer conversation with attorney Brian Stolars, who is Dwayne's lawyer and is a frequent Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice presenter. And you can register today by going to igsol.net/TIFwatch. And finally, we invite you to join us later this evening for this week's virtual Solidarity on Tap with Tom Shaboya, the president of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. If you're looking to hear another criminal justice perspective, we urge you to visit ISN Solidarity on Tap page at igsol.net/SOT for a recording of our Solidarity on Tap conversation last week with Sister Helen Prejean, founder of the Ministry Against the Death Penalty. And if you like today's conversation and want to share it with others or watch it again, this and all of ISN's videos are available on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube page. And so we hope you'll come back to that. And thank you again to Zach and Christina and Kara for being with us today. We're so grateful for your time and your continued work. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.